Hello, my name is Dr. Amy Grant and I'm a Senior Research Officer at Swansea University's Centre for Lactation, Infant Feeding and Translational Research. As well as being a researcher, I'm also a member of the autistic community, and that's something that you'll commonly see represented on social media using the hashtag #ActuallyAutistic. In this video, I'm going to outline the research evidence on how you, as somebody involved in promoting breastfeeding, can support autistic people to meet their breastfeeding goals. So let me just find the move on button. There it is. Okay, so before I start, let me just give you a rundown of what I'll cover today. So first of all, I'll talk a little bit about the sorts of language that you can use in relation to autism and autistic people, so that you're being respectful and not putting people on edge from the beginning. I'll then give you a very quick overview of the literature before talking about responses to a survey from over 190 people from the UK who are autistic and had been pregnant, and then I'll finish off by giving you some top tips for practice. But at the end of the presentation, there's also a list of blog posts that have been written by autistic people that you might want to check out after this. So before we can think about how you would support breastfeeding specifically, it's really important to know that language around autism and autistic people is something that is frequently used in a way that autistic people find offensive. So if someone's coming to you for support with breastfeeding and you use some of these offensive phrases, they may disengage before you even get to talking about breastfeeding. So that's why I've put this front and centre. So in terms of the name of the disability, we would call it autism. So older language like autistic spectrum disorder or autistic spectrum condition, which are sometimes shortened to ASD or ASC, really are not best practice anymore. Autistic people aren't disordered, we just have a different brain in terms of our neurodevelopment. Also, Asperger's syndrome is a historical diagnosis, so some people that have been diagnosed as children may still have that when they come through your service. But actually, Hans Asperger, who developed the guidelines for Asperger's syndrome, was actually a Nazi, and autistic people who were not considered to have Asperger's syndrome were actually killed under Nazi rule. So there's a really nasty eugenic supremacist tone around Asperger's syndrome. Some people who were given that diagnosis historically may prefer it. So if somebody says to you that they have Asperger's syndrome, I would carry on using the language that they've used, but I wouldn't use it unless a patient says it first to you. When we're talking about not just the disability, we're talking about the people, the terms to use are either an autistic person or autistic people. And I personally would say I'm autistic, and we see quite a lot of unusual phrases being used. And I think sometimes these come from a place of trying to be polite. But that stems from an understanding that being autistic is a bad thing, and actually autistic people would say that's not true. So for example, phrases like suffers with autism, we don't suffer with autism. Autistic people can suffer from a society that doesn't meet their needs, but that isn't the same thing as suffering with autism. Also, using person first language, so saying that somebody is a person with autism is something that the autistic community tend not to prefer, and that's because it kind of implies that the autism is something that you might take off and put in a cupboard. You know, it's not an integral part of you. So actually, person with autism really isn't preferred. Another one of these phrases is on the spectrum, and that comes from historical diagnoses of autistic spectrum disorder or condition. But the idea of a spectrum tends to be a straight line from A over here to B here, and you can say someone is more autistic here or less autistic here. And that's not actually accurate. So autism is a range of different things, and somebody can be less impaired by one thing. Oh, excuse my calendar reminder there. But actually still struggle with other things to a very high degree. So for example, thinking about myself, I obviously don't struggle in an education context. You know, I've got 3 degrees, but that doesn't mean that I don't still struggle to access my GP to get an appointment. You know, so using the idea of a spectrum also sits along what is known as functional labels. So they are things like saying that somebody is severely autistic, they're a high functioning autistic, or they have autism level 1 or autism level 2, and actually that's all really outdated, and that doesn't help with understanding that actually every autistic person will have struggles, often with accessing healthcare. So autistic person or people is fine. And then if we're thinking about comparing autistic people to people who aren't autistic, something that gets said to me an awful lot is, oh, we're all a little bit autistic. And actually, we're not all a little bit autistic, and that's quite offensive, in that it undermines the difficulties that I face because I'm autistic, where other people might face some of those difficulties some of the time and often to a lesser degree. It's not the same thing, it's not showing empathy. And actually being autistic isn't a bad thing, so we don't need you to pretend that everybody is a bit autistic. Normal people is also something that sometimes gets said, and again I think it's people being a bit nervous and trying to make sure they say the right thing. But there are 2 terms that are good to use. So the opposite of being autistic is being allistic, so literally the letter all and istic. So anybody who isn't autistic is allistic. And then if we think of autism as a part of being neurodivergent, so that's a broad range of conditions like ADHD, dyslexia, dyspraxia, global developmental delay. That's adding up to about 1/5 of the population. So together that little group are known as being neurodivergent, and the opposite of being neurodivergent, which is about 3/4 of the population, is being neurotypical. So anyway, that's taken a little while to talk through, but there's more information on the link at the bottom of the slide, and I will now get into the breastfeeding. So thinking about autistic people's experiences of breastfeeding, I did a literature review which was published earlier this year, but there were only 8 papers that had been published, so we include blogs and things as well just to get more information. And we found broadly that autistic people face the same challenges as autistic and neurotypical people in terms of struggling to access services. So perhaps that there weren't enough staff on the ward, or they didn't see anybody for several days when they were struggling, or tongue ties weren't identified. but actually some of the challenges were experienced to a greater extent, and I'll talk more about some of these issues when it comes to our survey respondents. But something about needing to phone to book an appointment for breastfeeding support, or needing to go to a breastfeeding support group, actually made it quite difficult for autistic people to access breastfeeding support. And then on top of this, there were some specific challenges that were related to being autistic, and they arose through things like interoception. So interoception is the understanding that each person has of what's going on inside their body. So you could think about it as your early warning system for when you're getting hungry or thirsty, or when you might need to go to the toilet. So neurotypical people tend to have these signals at a reasonably consistent level, so they'll get some notice. But actually, some autistic people feel them very intensely, so they could be uncomfortable or painful or very distracting, and others don't notice those internal kind of signs at all, because they're very, very quiet by comparison. So that's just a brief overview there, and the link for the full paper is at the bottom of the page. And I'll now move on to thinking about our survey. So I won't go through this in too much detail, but we had 193 people who'd been pregnant and were autistic from the UK. And they were quite a privileged group. The majority of people were speaking, they were cis women, they had white ethnicity, and they were highly educated, so almost 2/3 had an undergraduate degree. But actually almost 3/4 were disabled, and we asked about disability in addition to being autistic. So our group were reasonably similar to each other, and let's think about the things they told us about infant feeding. So first of all, in terms of the positive experiences, and this wasn't something that we found in the literature review. The literature review really had a tight focus on the challenges. We found that many autistic people had a strong desire to breastfeed. And something that's often talked about in relation to autism is people having challenges with regulation in relation to sensory. So, for example, if it's very noisy, that can be something that's quite dysregulating to an autistic person and might put them quite on edge. But actually sensory joy isn't talked about as much. But there's a really nice quotation on the screen about the sensation of the baby's body against mine is wonderful and very calming. So breastfeeding could be a source of sensory joy. It was also something that was used for self-regulation. So another participant talked about it being comforting, being in my own little bubble, so that's a nice, safe, protective space, and also feeling the oxytocin. We also had participants talk about feeling accomplished from being able to breastfeed. So one quotation on the slide talks about overcoming the feelings of being overwhelmed. So when there is too much sensory input, or communications are really difficult, and usual tools for getting back to being regulated aren't able to people, actually we need something to bring us back in. So breastfeeding helped this participant overcome those really big feelings of overwhelm, and it stopped this participant from shutting down. So that's when everything gets so hard that it's almost like a fight or flight reaction, but you get the freeze version where you just very much go into yourself and very quiet. And something that several participants said was that actually it would just be easier to breastfeed than managing with formula. So needing to think about preparing your bottles quite carefully and getting them ready around your baby's hunger cues was something that could be quite worrying. So moving on then to some of the autism-related challenges. So we also found some of the other challenges that I talked about from the literature with health professionals and accessing healthcare, but I'll talk about those later. But in terms of the things that were specifically about being in an autistic body, there were some really big challenges around sensory. So for example, touch could be something that was quite difficult, but in a variety of different ways. So feeling touched out means when you've had absolutely enough of somebody touching your skin. And we have a participant talking about my skin crawling sometimes. So it can be a very visceral reaction that if somebody touches you, it can feel very, very uncomfortable. We also had participants talking about milk letdown being uncomfortable, wet skin from leaking being unpleasant, and also the baby suckling could feel quite uncomfortable. In terms of noise, the baby crying was something that was really hard to cope with, and that obviously is more difficult when you're in those early stages when breastfeeding is more challenging. The noise of a breast pump was something that that some people said was really annoying, and also the noise of a suckling baby could be something that put people quite on edge. And the sorts of things that the parents did to help involve distracting themselves somehow or making the sensory environment around them as unoffensive as possible. So nobody being allowed to talk to them or touch them at the time that they were breastfeeding, or reading on their phone could be enough of a distraction that they could cope with these really difficult sensory experiences. And then going back to interoception, that's those feelings within your body. In the literature, it was reported that somebody had found breastfeeding and the milk letdown feeling as more painful than childbirth. So it can be very, very extreme. But the quote on the bottom right of the screen, I just had to put in for you. It felt like I had an old-fashioned telephone ringing in my breasts. I don't know how else to describe it, but thinking about it now, I can feel it again, and I haven't breastfed in over 9 years. So these things can feel quite different to your average neurotypical or holistic parent that comes to you. So, you know, when you're supporting people, it's about understanding that they might be having quite a different experience. And also something that I've mentioned is needing to do particular things and have particular routines and calming strategies for when you feel really dysregulated. And the intensity of breastfeeding and being the only parent that could feed a baby, especially in those early weeks with cluster feeding, was really challenging. So needing to be physically present prevented using my usual coping strategy of time alone to de-stress. So that's something that you might need to think about with the people you're supporting. I thought I'd include a specific slide on expressing, not because we had huge amounts of people talking about it, but because the ones who were mostly giving very strong accounts. So 3 people had quite neutral accounts, so that's on the bottom left of the screen. So, you know, I've decided to exclusively express, but most of the other comments were very strongly negative. So that it was unbearable. I hated expressing milk. It made me very angry instantly. I hated the noise and I hated how it felt. So that kind of really intense reaction is something that could be quite usual for autistic people. It can also feel difficult, so often autistic people may have signs of dyspraxia, so we're kind of clumsy. Not all of us, but definitely some of us, and it can be quite difficult doing more practical things. And also that the sensory impact could be quite different, so it could feel weird and it could also be painful. So then moving on to the last bit of the results, in terms of breastfeeding support, we didn't have huge amounts of people getting very good support. So it was common for participants to say that they didn't get enough information, or that the information they received was conflicting. We also had some participants reporting having their breasts grabbed, being manhandled, and that's something, you know, autistic people are more sensitive to touch than neurotypical people often, so that's something that you really do need to look out for in particular. But other people talked about being given verbal descriptions, midwives, health visitors, people at breastfeeding groups, watching feeds and giving tips. So we have a lovely quote on the bottom right. So I had a great breastfeeding support group locally with an in-person and online presence, so there was always someone to contact day or night. So, you know, those breastfeeding groups could make a real difference. But by contrast, telephone calls were really difficult, and actually some people just didn't try to get support when the only way to get it was by making that phone call, so it was just too much for them. Other people said that group support was too much, particularly when they were struggling with breastfeeding. The idea of having to expose part of their body to try to, you know, demonstrate feeding and get support on their latch was something that just felt so uncomfortable that even if they did it, it was quite anxiety inducing. And something else that also came out of the literature was autistic people researching how to breastfeed themselves a lot. But also that could be quite hard to then put it into practice. So you could know a lot of the theory, but actually being able to go, this is the precise issue we're having and this is the thing I should be doing, you know, it is very challenging. So then, getting on to my top tips. So I would say that historically, neurotypical people have spoken for autistic people a lot. But actually they often don't understand us very well, so always listen to autistic people. And when you're supporting someone who's autistic, really listen to what they're saying. And there's a common phrase, when you've met one autistic person, you've met one autistic person. That means just because you've supported one autistic person, the next person could have completely different bodily sensitivities and sensory experiences. So it really is going off what that individual person is communicating to you. But in general, use clear and direct communication. And if you're suggesting any tips around breastfeeding, it would be really good if you could follow up by sending a link to a video or something written or with diagrams to describe what you've said, so to help them go on to put that into practice. As I mentioned with the grabbing, always offer non-touch support options first and never touch an autistic person without asking. Because our needs can be more complex than your average breastfeeding person, if you can get continuity of support person, that would be really valuable to save the autistic person having to explain their needs over and over again to different people. And something that isn't particularly helpful is that not all autistic people will be diagnosed when they give birth. So it's quite common that once children have been diagnosed, their mothers then go on to get diagnosed. So this is maybe something to keep in the back of your mind for everybody that you support. And as I said right at the beginning, language matters. We're autistic. Don't be worried about saying that somebody is autistic. It's not a bad thing at all. If you want to read more about my tips, I wrote a piece for the Breastfeeding Network summer newsletter that I've linked at the bottom of the page. And on this slide you can see blogs that have come from autistic people around breastfeeding, and there are also a couple of books there. So if you want more information, these are really good places to read up and to get more informed. Okay, so that's everything for me now. So yes, I'll be here live with you shortly to answer any questions. Thank you very much. Bye.